Claire waited until the waiter cleared the memorial dinner plates before she betrayed me. Derek slid the folder across the steakhouse table and called it estate cleanup. My father's watch felt heavy on my wrist. I saw yellow signature tabs, a deed transfer packet, and a medical capacity letter from a doctor I had never met. Claire leaned toward her brother and said, "Don't worry, he hasn't read anything since the funeral." If I had shouted, they would have won the first minute. Derek would have called me unstable, Claire would have performed concern, and every relative in the room would have remembered my anger instead of their paperwork. So I let silence do what my father had taught me silence could do: make careless people fill the room with evidence. Derek laughed too loudly. Claire's hand tightened on my shoulder. A cousin stared into his coffee. I did not explain the clause. I only watched the two people who had mistaken my grief for emptiness discover that Dad had left more behind than tools. Dad used to say the first angry man in a room usually becomes the easiest man to dismiss. I heard him as clearly as if he were sitting beside me, smelling faintly of gasoline and peppermint gum. So I let Derek keep ownership of the performance. I kept ownership of the record. Frank Mercer's garage was not beautiful. It was a low brick building with a hand-painted sign, a floor stained black by 40 years of work, and a coffee can of bolts nobody dared throw away. But it was where neighbors came when they could not afford dealership prices. It was where Dad taught kids to change tires before winter. It was where I learned that patient hands could save a thing other people had already written off. Claire called it a money pit. Dad called it useful. Derek called it underdeveloped land. There were names carved under the workbench from boys who had grown into fathers, and women who had learned to check their own oil after bad divorces. Dad never advertised charity. He just rounded down invoices, accepted late payments, and pretended not to notice when a customer left tomatoes instead of cash. That place had more family in it than most dining rooms. The trouble started when the city announced a transit stop 2 blocks away. Suddenly, the garage sat inside a future corridor of apartments, retail bays, and investor language. Derek began mentioning mixed-use projects at cookouts. Claire began saying liquidity and tax burden with the same rhythm he used. I dismissed it as family friction, because marriage teaches you to translate contempt into concern if you are not careful. I told myself she wanted less stress for us. I did not want to admit she wanted less of me. I can see now how Claire's sentences changed before her behavior did. She stopped asking what the garage meant to me and started asking what it cost us. She stopped calling it your dad's place and started calling it that parcel. Language was the first survey stake Derek drove into our marriage. The folder was not estate cleanup. The buyer was a new LLC with a registered agent name I recognized from one of Dad's old warnings. The transfer price was absurdly low. The capacity letter implied I was too impaired by grief to manage property decisions without Claire's guidance. Derek had even included a cheerful cover note about simplifying my obligations. Grief had made me tired, not stupid. I photographed every page under the table, pocketed a duplicate exhibit, and let them believe embarrassment had driven me quiet. The medical letter was the cruelest page, because it used the truth as bait. I was grieving. I was exhausted. I had lost weight and forgotten appointments. But grief is not incompetence. Sorrow is not consent. They had taken the most human part of me and tried to turn it into a legal handle. After dinner, I drove to the garage in rain. The office still smelled like dust, rubber, and Dad's terrible coffee. His chair was pushed under the metal desk, as if he had stepped into the bay for a socket wrench and would be back in a minute. That was when grief finally bent me double. Not at the funeral, not at the steakhouse, but in that dark office where every labeled drawer proved he had expected tomorrow until tomorrow stopped coming. Rain ticked against the bay doors while I sat in Dad's chair. I wanted to call Claire and ask her to tell me I had misunderstood. That was the addict part of marriage, the part that reaches for the person who cut you because they used to be the person who bandaged you. Instead, I opened the drawer. Dad's old landline still held one safe. There was no triumph in hearing that message. If anything, it hurt that Dad had protected me from a thing I had refused to see while he was alive. I used to defend Claire when he grew quiet around her. I called him stubborn. Maybe he was only sad that I needed more proof than love should require. The private amendment was exactly where I remembered it. I had been in Tobias Reed's office when Dad signed it, bored then by all the careful language. Now, every sentence felt like a tool placed in my hand. The clause said any beneficiary, spouse, agent, or claimant who attempted a fraudulent transfer, coercive sale, or concealed self-dealing transaction involving the garage triggered trustee review and forfeited any claim to sale proceeds connected to the property. It was not magic. It was better. It was enforceable. Tobias had explained it years earlier while I stared at a framed diploma and wondered how much the meeting cost. Dad nudged my shoe under the table whenever he wanted me to pay attention. Dad had not written that clause because he was paranoid. He wrote it because he understood Derek. Greed doesn't always break a window, he told me once. Sometimes it brings a pen and says it's helping. Frank knew I hated conflict. He knew Claire could make practicality sound like love. He knew Derek could make theft sound like progress. The amendment was Dad admitting, in the only language that would survive him, that love sometimes needs paperwork. The amendment did not make Dad suspicious of everyone. He still loaned tools, still trusted teenagers with shop keys, still believed most people became better when someone expected them to be. But he knew the difference between trust and unlocked doors. Claire and Derek had counted on me confusing the two. I did not sleep. I made coffee in Dad's chipped mug and built a timeline across the office wall with painter's tape. Transit announcement, first consulting transfer, Derek's zoning inquiry, Frank's surgery, Claire's hospital updates, LLC formation, funeral, folder. By dawn, the betrayal was no longer a feeling. It had dates, amounts, names, and signatures. Sequence turned suspicion into proof. The first timeline was ugly. I wrote too large, crossed things out, and taped pages crooked because my hands would not settle. Then the mechanic in me took over, one symptom at a time, one noise before another. Dad had taught me diagnosis by sequence. What changed first, what failed second, what only looked related because panic wanted a simple story. The scheme became less supernatural when I treated it like an engine problem. Air, fuel, spark, compression. Announcement, money, illness, pressure. I wrote each date on a separate sheet because I needed to see distance. Lies compress time. They make everything feel like one emergency. The wall spread the scheme back out. It showed planning where Claire claimed panic. It showed investment where Derek claimed concern. It showed patience on their side, which meant I was allowed patience on mine. The bank records hurt more than I expected. Claire had been paying Derek from our joint account in small, neat amounts labeled consulting. They began 2 weeks after the transit announcement and stopped the week Dad entered hospice, then started again after the funeral home cashed my check. I stared at those entries until the numbers blurred. She had not stumbled into her brother's plan at the memorial dinner. She had been financing its rehearsal. I thought about every dinner where Claire said we should cut back, every time she sighed at the electric bill, every time she told me Dad's place was draining us. Meanwhile, she was moving our money into Derek's pocket so he could come back later and offer to rescue me from the burden he helped manufacture. At the zoning office, June Park helped me without breaking a single rule. She remembered Dad because he had fixed her mother's brakes during a snowstorm and refused more than parts cost. Public records were public, she reminded me. Derek's pre-application mentioned anticipated family control of the parcel. It was filed before Dad died. The buyer LLC had been formed before the funeral flowers wilted. June did not dramatize anything, which made me trust her immediately. She printed what the portal allowed, stamped what the rules allowed, and slid the pages over with a look that said she understood more than she would ever put in a sentence. Institutions are cold until one decent person shows you which form preserves the truth. Mara Ortiz, Dad's bookkeeper, answered on the second ring. She had a voice like warm gravel and no patience for sorrow used as a weapon. She had scanned ledgers, tax receipts, and emails because Frank asked her to. The taxes Claire claimed were crushing me had been prepaid. The insurance reserve was funded. There was no emergency. Urgency was Derek's crowbar. Mara's office smelled like paper, lemon cleaner, and the kind of patience that makes sloppy men nervous. She did not hug me when I cried. She handed me tissues, waited, and then gave me the next document. That was mercy. She treated me like a man wounded enough to... Tobias Reed listened without interrupting. Then he told me not to threaten anyone, not to sign anything, not to confront Derek alone, and not to underestimate how desperate a collapsing deal can make a confident man. Tobias was dry and exact, the kind of attorney who made boring words feel like locked doors. He said the packet was invalid if obtained through deception. More importantly, it might activate the forfeiture review. He asked for copies, not adjectives. That saved me. I wanted to tell him how betrayal felt in my chest, how Claire's voice had sounded, how Derek's grain made me want to overturn the table. Tobias listened, then brought me back to documents. Feelings told me where to look. Documents would decide what happened next. Claire came home that night wearing her softest sweater and her frightened wife voice. She said Derek had pushed too hard. She said she only wanted to protect me from bills and decisions. I asked when she learned the buyer was Derek's LLC. She said that night. I showed her the transfer memo from our joint account. I asked why her printer generated the capacity letter PDF. She said she had forgotten. I asked why she sent Dad's hospital updates to Derek. She tried memory first. She mentioned the cabin we rented the year Mom died, the winter I had the flu, the way she held my hand at Dad's first oncology appointment. Each memory was real, which made the performance crueler. A lie made entirely of falsehood is easy to reject. A lie braided through true tenderness asks you to betray your own past to survive the present. I almost apologized for questioning her. That reflex frightened me more than her answers did. So I changed the shape of the conversation. No speeches, no accusations. I asked only questions that had dates attached. What day did Derek first mention the LLC? What time did you print the letter? Which doctor signed it? And why did his office say they had never met me? Claire's face hardened in layers. The wife disappeared, then the actress, then the strategist. By the time she asked whether Tobias had seen everything, I knew the marriage had become another document to preserve, not a home to repair. There had been a time when that sweater meant Sunday mornings and grocery lists, and her feet tucked under my leg on the couch. Watching her use it like a costume was almost worse than the folder. She knew which version of herself I missed, and she sent that version into the kitchen to negotiate. The marriage did not end because Claire lied. I had survived lies before by explaining them away. It ended when I realized she was measuring my evidence. She was not confessing. She was calculating the blast radius. Every answer tested what I knew and what I could prove. Once I saw that, the old habit of defending her cracked. Love does not ask how much of the knife you noticed. Mara forwarded an email Frank wrote 18 months earlier. If Claire starts talking like Derek about the garage, slow everything down, he had written. Make them put names on paper. Greed hates signatures, unless it controls where they go. I sat alone in the office and laughed once. Not because it was funny, but because Dad had known all along that my weakness was not trust. It was trusting without receipts.
That sentence about signatures became my rule. If Derek called, I asked him to email. If Claire cried, I asked her to write down what she meant. If someone said everyone knew, I asked who exactly and when. Vague pressure had built the trap. Specific records would take it apart. Derek left cheerful voicemails about helping me be realistic. He sent contractors to measure the garage windows. His buyer LLC scheduled a title call before any valid transfer existed. The more carefully Tobias moved, the louder Derek became. He called me selfish, backward, emotional, and vindictive. Confident men often mistake volume for title. He told one contractor I was having a hard time letting go. He told another the family had approved access. Men like Derek do not merely lie. They distribute little versions of reality and hope nobody compares copies. Unfortunately for him, comparing copies was exactly how Dad had raised me. Tobias sent formal notice to the trustee, the buyer LLC, the title company, and Derek's lender. The letter was bloodless, which made it terrifying. It named suspected fraud, concealed self-dealing, forged capacity.
Tobias also warned me about the temptation to become entertaining. He said angry people feed bad opponents because anger gives them something human to discredit. Paper is boring, and boring is useful. Boring makes lenders pause. Boring makes title officers ask for indemnity. Boring makes men like Derek pay real lawyers to answer questions they thought grief would bury. I taped that lesson above Dad's desk. Be boring enough to be dangerous. For 3 days, I answered almost nothing in real time. If a call came, I let it go to voicemail. If a text arrived, I saved it. If someone said Derek was only trying to help, I asked them to send that in writing after reading Tobias's notice. Most did not. Pressure needs atmosphere. Records remove the air. I read the letter 3 times before Tobias sent it. It did not call Derek evil. It did not call Claire cruel. It simply placed their actions in order and attached exhibits. That restraint felt like power. For the first time since Dad died, I understood that calm was not the absence of anger. Calm was anger harnessed to a useful machine.
The phone calls began the next morning. The lender wanted clean title. The title company wanted indemnity. The buyer's counsel wanted clarification. Derek wanted me to call off my lawyer before I ruined everything. That phrase told me exactly whose everything mattered to him. The deal had depended on me being too broken to read. Once I read, the machinery jammed. Derek's messages changed punctuation first. Periods became exclamation points. Then came all caps. Then threats disguised as concern. Then offers to talk man to man. I did not meet him. I had spent years being reasonable with people who moved the definition of reasonable whenever money appeared. This time, reasonable had a letterhead. Claire stopped pretending to comfort me. She called the garage a shrine, then a disease, then Frank's leash around my neck. She said I cared more about dead metal than my living wife. For a second, the old guilt rose in me. Then I remembered the forged letter, the LLC, the consulting fees, and Dad's hospital updates in Derek's inbox. She had not wanted to save me from grief. She had wanted to use it while it kept me quiet. I let her finish because every word taught me what I no longer had to carry. She said I was choosing a building over a marriage. I said she had chosen a sale over a funeral. The silence after that was the first honest thing we had shared in months. In mediation, Claire's attorney began with marital contribution and equitable interest. Tobias said very little. The timeline said the rest. The attempted transfer weakened every claim she tried to make against the garage proceeds. Privacy became more important to her than victory. She signed a settlement, acknowledging the attempted transfer and leaving the garage outside her reach. The settlement was not cinematic. There were conference rooms, revisions, signatures, and the tired ritual of dividing objects that once belonged to a shared life. But one thing stayed clean. The garage was not converted into a payout for the people who tried to steal it. Dad's claws held. Derek made one last mistake. He arrived at the garage with a locksmith, 2 contractors, and the swagger of a man who had already spent money he did not own. I was waiting with Tobias, Mara, June, and a sheriff's civil deputy. The bay doors stayed closed. The contractors looked from the deputy to the letter in Tobias's hand and discovered urgent progress could wait. I arrived before dawn because I wanted 1 hour alone with the place before the performance began.
the shop lights hummed awake one row at a time. Dust moved through the beams like the building was breathing. I unlocked Dad's office, set the trust binder on the desk, and made myself drink coffee slowly. Not because I felt calm, but because I wanted my body to practice the shape of calm before Derek gave it a reason to forget. When Mara arrived, she brought donuts nobody ate. June brought stamped copies in a folder with a rubber band around it. Tobias brought 2 pens, 3 copies of the notice, and the expression of a man who had billed enough hours to know silence was sometimes the most expensive sound in a room. He wore sunglasses, though the morning was gray. That detail stays with me, because it captured him perfectly. A man performing confidence for an audience that had already read the script. The locksmith would not meet my eyes. One contractor muttered that he had not signed up for family court. I handed Derek the trustee notice. My voice did not shake. Dad knew you would count on grief, I said. He also knew grief eventually clears. Derek called it a misunderstanding. Tobias asked whether he wanted to make that statement in writing. Mara adjusted her glasses. June folded her stamped copies against her clipboard. The contractor stepped backward, because working men can smell a bad job before lawyers finish explaining it. Derek stared at the notice as if paper had betrayed him by containing words. He looked at Claire, then at the deputy, then at me. For once, charm had nowhere to land. He had built the deal on my silence, but the garage yard was full of witnesses, and every witness had a copy.
Claire broke only when she understood the plan was gone. She did not ask what Dad had wanted. She did not ask how I was sleeping. She asked what happened to her share. That question freed me more than any apology could have. I had been grieving the woman I hoped she was. The woman in front of me was grieving a payout. I do not know what answer I wanted from her. Remorse, maybe? An admission that Dad had deserved better? One sentence proving she understood the human shape of what she had done. Instead, she asked about her share. And the last imaginary Claire I had been protecting finally walked out of my mind. Months later, Derek faced civil fraud claims and a licensing investigation. I will not pretend consequence healed everything. Some mornings, I still reached for my phone to tell Dad a thing only he would understand. Some nights, the house felt too quiet. But quiet without deception is different from quiet inside a lie. It gives you room to hear your own thoughts return. The garage became Frank's second chance auto, a training shop for foster teens, veterans, and neighbors who needed useful skills more than motivational speeches. Mara handled the books. June sent interns. Tobias pretended the ribbon cutting was a waste of billable time while standing in the front row. We kept Dad's old sign on the wall, not because the past owned us, but because it had paid for the future. The name came from a conversation I almost missed. A veteran named Luis stood under the lift, looking at a transmission like it had personally insulted him, and said every machine deserves one honest second chance before people start replacing it. Dad would have liked that. I thought about people then, about the chances I had given Claire that were not honest because they required me to ignore evidence. A second chance is not the same as unlimited access. Repair requires admission of damage. Otherwise, you are not repairing anything. You are teaching the break to continue. We did not make the shop into a museum. Dad would have hated that. We replaced unsafe lifts, painted the office, added training benches, and kept the scarred counter where customers had signed receipts for decades. Legacy is not freezing a place in amber. Legacy is keeping its usefulness alive. On the first Saturday class, a 17-year-old asked why the old sign still said Mercer and Son when Frank was gone. I handed him Dad's wrench and showed him how to feel pressure before forcing the bolt. Son isn't only blood, I told him. Sometimes it's a promise to carry useful work forward. The engine turned over on the second try. The papers they wanted me not to read became the map that led me back to myself. Dad taught me that bolts strip when you force them from the wrong angle, and people do too.
He never said it like wisdom. He said it while kneeling beside an old pickup, asking me to slow down enough to feel what the metal was telling me. For years, I mistook his patience for avoidance. After the memorial dinner, I understood it as preparation. That memory became a kind of prayer. Slow down, feel the angle, do not force what should be understood. Claire and Derek forced everything. Dad had left me the opposite inheritance. Patience, labels, witnesses, the stubborn belief that repair is possible, but only after you stop pretending the damage is imaginary.
People imagine revenge as a speech. Mine was a spreadsheet, a certified letter, and the discipline not to answer Claire's midnight accusations. Every time she called me cruel for asking questions, I added the message to the file. Restraint felt unnatural until I realized it was the only language their paperwork understood. Frank did not leave me wealth in Derek's sense of the word. He left labels, copies, witnesses, reserves, and a clause sharp enough to cut through a lie without becoming one. He left work that still mattered. He left me proof that a quiet man can protect his son, even from beyond the reach of a phone call. When people ask what the garage was worth, they expect a number. I can give them one now, higher than Derek's offer and lower than his fantasy. But the real answer is different. It was worth one grieving man not being tricked into erasing his father. It was worth a dozen students learning a trade. It was worth the truth arriving with receipts. The earliest proof was not financial. It was a memory I had ignored because grief made everything around Dad's surgery feel fogged. Claire kept stepping into the hallway with her phone turned face down against her leg. I thought she was updating relatives. The records later showed she was forwarding medication changes and prognosis notes to Derek. Not for comfort, for timing. They were waiting for the week when Dad could no longer argue and I could barely stand. The LLC had a bland name, but June showed me how to follow the registered agent to an office Derek used for 3 other projects. One project had displaced a bakery. Another had promised affordable units that never appeared. Derek did not build communities. He harvested language from people who did, then sold the ground beneath them. Mara laid the tax reserve in. After Tobias sent notice, I slept 4 hours in Dad's office chair. It was not good sleep, but it was clean. No bargaining dreams, no version of Claire coming through the door to explain it all away. Just rain, the old wall clock, and the strange mercy of knowing the worst answer was probably the true one. The contractors at the gate were not villains. They were men with tool belts and schedules who had been told the paperwork was settled. That mattered to me. I did not want innocent people dragged into Derek's fraud. When Tobias explained the dispute, they packed up fast, irritated at Derek instead of me. Truth changes where inconvenience points. On settlement day, Claire wore the same perfume she wore when we signed our first mortgage. I noticed because memory is cruel that way. She did not look at me while the acknowledgement clause was read. Attempted transfer, undisclosed interest, no claim against trust property. Each phrase landed softly and permanently, like dirt on a coffin. I sold some things from the house because objects can become little traps. I kept Dad's watch, the chipped mug, the trust binder, and the wrench with his initials burned into the handle. Not everything old is sacred, but some things carry instructions after the person who used them is gone. The first students did not arrive looking inspired. They arrived suspicious, bored, and cold. That was fine. Inspiration is overrated at the beginning. Competence is better. By the 3rd Saturday, one of them diagnosed a bad alternator before I did. He tried not to smile when I noticed. I let him fail at hiding it. People asked if I forgave Claire. I learned to answer carefully. Forgiveness, if it comes, is private. Release is practical. I released the need for her to understand me, the urge to make Derek admit what he was, and the old reflex of shrinking my life so someone else could feel taller. The garage doors opened easier after that. The first customer after reopening was June's mother, because stories like this enjoy circles.
Her old sedan needed more patience than parts. I let Nolan write the estimate, while I watched his confidence move from his shoulders into his hands. When the engine settled into a steady idle, nobody cheered. We just listened. That sound meant more than victory over Derek. It meant the place was working again. Not as a monument to what they tried to steal, but as proof that useful things can survive greedy plans and still have room for new hands. And for the first time since the funeral, I could hear Dad's laugh in the open bay without needing it to answer back. I locked the office last, not because the day was over, but because I finally understood the work could continue without fear.